Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so thrilled you've joined me for a story tonight, because there's nothing that beats a good story, and this is a very exciting story. So if you've missed out on part 1, please click on the description, because you don't want to miss out on the entire story. And share this video with your friends, because I'd be very grateful for that. So let's get started, shall we? Erin found herself contentedly sitting in the knee-high grass, surrounded by the pretty alpine flowers, pollinating bees and butterflies. She no longer had an EpiPen at her disposal, should the worst happen, but she did not care. She had saved a little Bigfoot's life. She felt triumphant. What were the remote chances of being in the right place at the right time, to help out a Bigfoot in distress? And until this point in time, she had never quite fully believed in the cryptic, idiosyncratic creature, which she ascertained was just a fictitious creature of legend. She marvelled in what she had beheld, and considered herself remarkably privileged to have such a fabulous encounter. Did that really happen? Erin asked herself, unable to suppress the giggle that bubbled out of her mouth. It bloody did! It bloody did! It really happened to me, she told herself. Sometimes the truth can be stranger than fiction, and if anyone heard my story, they wouldn't believe it in a million years. For some reason this thought pleased her greatly. Erin loved mystery of every kind. She knew that her life would never be quite the same again, for her perception of the natural world had significantly shifted. Little was Erin to know that one day her good deed would be paid back in kind, in ways she couldn't envisage possible. 8 years later, Erin smiled as the taxi driver pulled up outside the front door of her home. "Are you sure this is it, miss?" the taxi driver asked her. Erin could barely speak. Seeing her house again brought back so many wistful, nostalgic memories that a huge lump developed in the back of her throat. Her eyes began to glaze over with unshed tears. She had missed her home and her parents more than anything in the entire world. It seemed so surreal that she was back home again. Her absence from North Carolina had been duly felt, especially by her. "Is this the place?" The taxi driver repeated the question, almost as if he thought Erin might be hard of hearing. He glanced at Erin briefly through the visor mirror. Yes, this is it," said Erin. She stared at her old family home, as if viewing an old friend she hadn't seen for a long time, taking it all in. The classic-style white house, with its rambling red roses growing around the front door, and the purple wisteria tumbling over the outside wall, with its gleaming French windows, seemed to be smiling back at her, and it was one of the most welcome sights Erin had ever beheld in a very long time. There really was no place like home, she privately concluded to herself. "This is definitely it," she reaffirmed, choking back the heartfelt tears that were threatening to break through the barrier of her restraint, like heavy clouds that can no longer retain their high volume of water. It may have only been 5 years, but it seemed like a whole lifetime ago, since Erin had physically been back to North Carolina and walked through the red-painted front door of their home. Her mother had always painted their front door red, as it was an auspicious colour according to Chinese mythology that attracted wealth and prosperity into your home, and her mother was very interested in feng shui. Her heart began to flutter excitedly in her chest. She was here to stay with her parents for 6 entire weeks, and despite her very best efforts, some tears began to roll down her cheeks as she saw Mr. Perkins, the family cat she hadn't seen in 5 long years, licking himself contentedly in the window of the kitchen, with his legs fully splayed, positioning his body in a peculiar angle, so his large, fleecy underbelly was fully exposed. It would seem he was completely oblivious that he was being watched by Erin. He was happily grabbing the prisms of sunshine that danced through the kitchen window of the north-facing room, as he always did first thing in the morning. Some things never changed. "Are you all right, miss?" asked the taxi driver, looking at her with concern on his face. "You are crying, miss," he said, handing her a tissue. "Thanks," said Erin, wiping the tears away with a tissue. "You must forgive me. I'm a little over-emotional, that's all. Rather sentimental. I haven't been back home in 5 years, you see. I'm crying because it's just so good to be back."
"Ah, I see," said the taxi driver, rubbing the stubble on his chin reflectively. "That explains a whole lot. You know what they say. There is no place like home. I must say the age-old proverb is exactly right. I can vouch for that myself, every time I return home, after a day spent on the road."
"It's so funny that you should say that. I was thinking about the exact same thing, only seconds ago. You must have heard my thoughts. That's right. There is no place like home, is there?"
"Absolutely not. Do you mind me asking you, ma'am, where have you been for 5 long years? I confess I am a bit of a snoop," he teased. "I'm just very interested in my passengers. Believe me, I've heard all kinds of idiosyncratic stories over the years. That's why I thoroughly enjoyed being a taxi driver. So what brings you back to North Carolina?"
"London," said Erin. "Well, that's where I've been, to be more precise. Oxford in England. I was doing English literature at Oxford University. I've never got to come back home for 5 years. Everything looks strangely the same, and yet it doesn't, if you know what I mean. The trees on the street, well, they're so much taller than I remember. I can see some people have renovated their properties a wee bit. The yards are exceptionally colourful this summer, and all the roses over my parents' front door. They've never looked so spectacular. And that wisteria is in full bloom late in the season. It's uncanny."
"It's always the trees people notice when they've been away for a long time. They come back to find the tiny little seedling in the front yard is a giant," said the taxi driver in agreement. He paused for a brief moment. "Oxford, huh? That's impressive. You must be as bright as a button to go to a place like that. I'm impressed. Welcome back to North America, and us simpletons here in North Carolina that cannot boast an Oxford degree."
"Oh, it's great to be back, believe me it is. And for the record, I'm no boffin. They're fantastic universities here in America. Believe it or not, quite a few regular people go to Oxford University. We're not all academic nerds, you know. Well, I'm certainly not. And I wouldn't like to be tarnished with such a formidable reputation. That would be bleak, believe me. I just love English, that's all. That's why I went there in the first place. I also thoroughly enjoy a change of scene. So going to a new country, it seemed like a great idea at the time."
"Modest too, with it," said the taxi driver. "I like it. So tell me, did you like living in England? I've only been there once a long time ago, when I was a child. I do remember it was extremely cold."
"Yes, it was great. I still live there at the moment, but you know, America is my home, and I adore it here. It's so great to be back, I can't tell you."
"You're a lady after my own heart, ma'am. I feel much the same about this great country of ours. Come, let me help you with your luggage," said the driver, opening the door and heading towards the trunk to remove the suitcases.
Erin looked up from the back seat of the taxi, with her hand on the passenger side door, ready to open. And that was when she saw her mother and dad, standing there in the doorway of their home, with the widest, most joyous smiles on their faces. They were as eager to see Erin as she was to see them, and her mother was struggling to fight back the tears that were literally spilling down her cheeks. Erin hurriedly threw open the door of the car and sashayed towards her parents. With wide open arms, she sobbed into their chests, wetting the front of their shirts, for these were her favourite people in the entire world, who had sacrificed so much on her account, so that she could go to Oxford University. She was bursting with unbridled joy to see them again. "I missed you, Dad! I missed you, Mum! You've no idea! You've got no idea!"
"You can't have missed us more than we've missed you, my love. It is so good to have you home," said her father, purring contentedly. "I thought this day would never ever come. It's been far too long. I'm only sorry we didn't get to visit you in London. But with my sister so very sick over the last 5 years, it seemed wrong to leave her side. because we weren't sure if we left the country that she'd suddenly go downhill rapidly. We couldn't take that risk, could we?
I'm so sorry, Dad, about Auntie Lisa. I really am. And I am sorry I missed her funeral.
These things happen, sweetheart, said her father. You know how it is, my love. The cancer finally got the better of her, but she fought a long, hard fight. But I'm afraid cancer is a tough, formidable opponent to beat, and Lisa was considerably older than me. In the end, something will take us all. Death, I'm afraid, is no respecter of persons. That's what I've learnt over the years.
Now let's not go there and talk about such morbid stuff, shall we, my darling? Said Erin's mother, not liking to wallow on the unsavoury discussion of death. You are back home, and that's all that matters. I want you to tell us all about England, and of course the potato pub in Oxford, that you claim makes the fluffiest baked potatoes that you've ever tasted. I want to learn about whom you went punting with in Oxford on that long stretch of river. You looked like you were having a whale of a time. I felt quite envious, actually. I want to know all about the people in that photograph you sent me. Looks like an interesting bunch, I hasten to say.
Oh, that,
said Erin nonchalantly. Yes, I recall it was a fun day out. The people in the photograph share the tiny little semi-detached house we rent together in Oxford. It's close to the university, you see. It's a great town, Oxford. A lot like Boston, actually. It's got that university vibe to it, if you know what I mean. Everyone cycles everywhere. The streets are quaint and steeped in history. And there's so many lovely shops and charming pubs. Well, the potato pub is my absolute favourite. They do a mean chicken pie. And those fluffy baked potatoes are enormous. They're to die for. I actually asked the owner when he was drunk how his potatoes got like that. I figured if he was sober, he'd be reluctant to tell me. I was worried he wouldn't reveal his secrets. It turns out it's not so much the cooking of the potato, but of course that counts. But it is the type of potato you use to get that fluffy result. And in England they have so many different kinds of spuds or potatoes. The owner of the pub uses a specially unique potato for his diners, especially used for baking. But I'll tell you all about it. Must I talk about Oxford? I want to talk about you and to hear what's been happening around here while I've been away. You have no idea how much I've missed this place. I've thought about you all the time.
Like we've never stopped thinking about you, my love, said Erin's father, sweeping his daughter in his arms. You should have seen me. I was counting the days for you to come home. I was that excited. It was like having a Christmas calendar.
Erin did not notice the taxi rolling away, and her father surreptitiously taking her heavily stuffed suitcases up the stairs, slipping them into her old bedroom, where her mother had lovingly prepared the bedroom with generous vases of Erin's favourite lilac-coloured roses. Nor did she notice Mr. Perkins, whom on realising one of his favourite people in the entire world had miraculously returned from the dead, was now affectionately rubbing his long sleek body against her legs, so that her long black pants with the large bell bottoms were now covered in downy grey hair. Erin felt as if she was caught up in a very happy illusory dream. It was so great to be back, so good. In 5 years her parents had grown considerably older, and her mother had a few more crow's feet around her eyes, but it made her look all the more endearing. The house smelt much the same as it always had, of leather, furniture polish, and her mother's favourite jasmine-scented candles that she regularly burnt around the house. Erin was sad not to hear the pitter-patter of familiar paws from her favourite schnauzer, Mr. Tibbles, who had sadly died of old age while she was away in Oxford. Her parents had been too grievously upset, well, her mother had been, to replace their beloved pet, claiming no one could ever take Mr. Tibble's place.
I keep telling your mother, Erin, that we should get another schnauzer, but she won't have any of it, her father had told her. You know what your mother's like. I'm hoping in time, when her grief settles a little, she might change her mind. We could do with another family dog around the place.
Erin could definitely feel that something was missing, without Mr. Tibbles around, but she discreetly said nothing, as even mentioning the name would make her mother teary-eyed.
"Let me take a long, hard look at you, Aaron," said her mother,
stepping backwards to examine her daughter, as if taking a studying of a painting in an art gallery.
"You do look quite marvellous, my love. You have grown up so much in 5 years. I love the fact you've cut your long blonde hair to a shoulder-length bob. It really suits your heart-shaped face. Now come on in. Get yourself cosy and comfortable in the kitchen. Let me have a good old chinwag with you, and prepare some warm milk and cookies like you used to enjoy them when you were little. I hope you don't think you're too old and sophisticated for warm milk and homemade chocolate chip cookies, are you?"
"Mum," said Erin, perching her hands on her hips, "the day I'm too old for your warm milk and chocolate chip cookies will be when I'm pushing up the daisies. It sounds absolutely perfect," she said, picking up the purring Mr. Perkins in her arms and giving him a cuddle. Then she followed her mother into the kitchen. It looked whiter than she remembered, with its marble countertops and gleaming French-style cabinets. "I hope you've been good while I've been away, boy. Not decapitating all the mice in town, have you?"
"Don't ask Mr. Perkins that, my love. You won't like the answer. Some things never change," said Erin's mother, laughing. "You have no idea about the monstrosities I usually find lying under your bed. But the less said about that, the better. Put it this way, Mr. Perkins is a serial killer of note when it comes to the mice population. Some might say that that was a good thing, but I'm surprised that the mice in this part of North Carolina have not been completely decimated by him. Let's just say Mr. Perkins is considerably worse than a fox in a chicken coop. It's not just one mice I find, it's 100 or more. I'm just glad he doesn't go after the birds in the yard. That would be devastating for me. Thank goodness he's only fixated on the mice. So what's it like being home, darling? Is it kind of surreal?"
her mother asked her, as she put on a pan of warm milk on the gas hob, shuffling around a large cake tin. She started piling a plate high with her homemade chocolate chip cookies. Erin salivated. She had never tasted cookies to beat her mother's, and when she tasted them again, she felt as if she'd died and gone to heaven, and they were better than she even remembered. "I'm over the moon to be back, Mum," said Erin, when she found herself comfortably seated at the kitchen table, opposite her dad and her mother. She was dunking her mother's chocolate chip cookies into warm milk and taking appreciative mouthfuls as the chocolate melted in her mouth. "Oh, Mum, these cookies are so good," she enthused. "I can't wait to catch up with all the town gossip. I'm sure you've got so much to tell me. Is it true that Mrs. Weedle has dyed her hair bright pink? When I heard that, I nearly had a heart attack. That mousy woman has only ever worn brown tweeds. She's a typical schoolmarm with a matronly figure. She's never worn a colourful thing a day in her life. And you're telling me she's actually dyed her hair pink? And she's got a boyfriend half her age? Are you kidding me? Or is this some kind of a wind-up?" Erin's mother chuckled. "You know me, my darling. When have I ever exaggerated about a thing to you? That woman has undergone a radical metamorphosis, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. It's quite extraordinary. It would seem the brown dowdy clothes are quite definitely a thing of the past. Mrs. Weedle has completely revamped her entire wardrobe. She's dressing as elegantly as if she stepped out of a bandbox or walking down the catwalk. I mean, she looks $1 million these days. Half her age, I have to say. Some people think she's had a secret little facelift, a nip and a tuck here and there. I think it's very possible. Unless, of course, she's been punnelled with Botox and fillers within an inch of her life, like all the movie stars and celebrities do, who spare no expense when it comes to waging war against the wrinkles and the crow's feet. I mean that quite literally. You'd barely recognise her if you saw her." "So it's true, then?" asked Erin incredulously. "It is indeed, my love. At first no one in town could possibly believe it, when Mrs. Weedle herself suddenly came into the bar, looking as colourful as a parrot, very stylishly dressed. She looked marvellous. Me and your father were having a casual drink in the bar, along with a light snack.
I said to your father, 'Is that Glenys over there?' Your father said to me, 'It can't be. The resemblance is uncanny, but there is no way on God's earth that is her. When have you seen Glenys made up like a movie star, wearing such colourful, stylish clothes?' But it was her, let me tell you. And everyone in the bar was just gawking at her. They were so astonished. We must have looked very rude the way we were gawking. But the transformation was absolutely monumental. You know Mrs. Weedle, always been the shrinking violet, who you often don't even notice because she blends into the background with her monochromatic colour schemes that she wears. Not any more, my love. Quite the contrary, in fact. As I told you, I literally did have a coronary arrest on the spot. I was completely confounded, flabbergasted. We soon learnt the reason for the miraculous transformation, said Erin's mother, lowering her voice to a low whisper, as if she was worrying that eavesdroppers could hear her words. It's all about a man, Erin, my dear. Mrs. Weedle is hopelessly in love with a young man who is a fraction of her age, I have to say. Erin's father suppressed a chuckle. It was a man half her age that has transformed the ugly duckling into a swan, shall we say. I think he's 31. Mrs. Weedle, well, she's 65, isn't she? So there's a considerable age gap between the two of them. But you know, some men like older women, don't they? Erin gasped. You've got to be joking. The perennial town spinster who's never said boo to a goose, who's so prim and proper, who hasn't had a boyfriend her whole life, is now dating a man half her age. That's nonsensical. Where on earth did she meet him? My guess it's one of those rather ambiguous dating platforms you hear about, said Erin's mother gingerly. Possibly Tinder or meetyourmatch.com. Something like that, I imagine. I worry the poor woman is making a complete fool of herself. What do you mean? Asked Erin soberly. Erin's mother shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. I don't know, my darling, but there's a considerable age gap between the two of them, which is significant, isn't it? It always sounds warning bells to me when there's a huge age gap with a couple. Maybe the couple genuinely love each other, and if that's the case, I wish them both all the best. Now, I haven't got an issue with age. I mean, it is a number, is it not? But so often relationships with huge age gaps, they don't usually work. If it's a younger woman, she tends to leave the man later on. And the other way round, honestly, I don't know what to think about that. I only worry, you know. Worry about what? Asked Erin. Well, it's no big secret, is it, darling, that Mrs. Weedle is a very wealthy woman. Her father died recently. Even though her mother's alive, he left her a considerable fortune. And you think that this man may be after Mrs. Weedle's money? Is that what you're saying? I'm afraid so, my love. I know it sounds despicable to talk like this. It's so awful to assume the worst in someone, is it not? But I can't help being naturally suspicious. Do you know anything about this man? Asked Erin. Where does he come from? Stuff like that. Do you know? No, darling, I wish I did, but I know nothing about him. But when I was having lunch at the Old Swan, who should come into the bar but Mrs. Weedle and Loverboy himself? I tell you, my darling, I nearly choked over my cheese and pickle sandwich then and there. It affirmed all the rumours were true, that had been spreading around town like wildfire, that Mrs. Weedle's transformation was due to a man, and a younger one at that. So I had a long, hard look at him. I want to tell you, Loverboy, well, he looked, Erin's mother struggled to find the word she was looking for. Erin's father intervened. I think what your mother is trying to say, dear, is he looked rather slick. There was something quite underhanded and shifty about him. It's difficult to really put into words, but he was, you know, rather dodgy looking, and seemed very indifferent towards all the locals, not very friendly at all. Quite aloof, actually. Don't get me wrong, my darling, said Erin's mother. He was handsome, good-looking, but it just felt all wrong. Rather off, if you know what I mean. They were behaving in the bar like a couple of besotted, giggly teenagers, with hands all over each other, which for a woman of Mrs. Weedle's age is a tad inappropriate, don't you think? It gets worse, I'm afraid. We learnt that they'd just been to Las Vegas and got married, very quickly, and guess what? Mrs. Weedle refused to sign a prenuptial agreement, so that left me feeling even more concerned about Mrs. Weedle. I was wondering if the poor gullible woman is being manipulated by this young man. He could potentially divorce her, walk away with half of her fortune, and my feeling is that that is what he intends to do. I'm very concerned about poor Mrs. Weedle. A lot of older women get exploited like this by young men, claiming to be madly in love with them, and because they're very lonely, they believe every word they're told. You hear about it all the time, these people online being exploited by men who claim to love them.
They got married, said Erin, gasping. You are kidding me.
I wish I were, my love, but no, I'm not. Mrs. Weedle announced to everyone that she and Reese had got married. She insisted on buying everyone in the bar the most expensive French champagne to celebrate their special day. She paid for a whole lot of delicious finger snacks for people to enjoy. It really was lovely, and she looked so desperately happy. I was genuinely thrilled for her, but deep down my stomach was twisting in all kinds of knots. There's something about Reese, you see. I can't put a finger on it, but I just don't trust him an inch. Normally I'd be so happy for Mrs. Weedle. I mean, she deserves so much happiness, doesn't she? But I feel so unsettled about this whole wretched business.
That's incredibly naive, said Erin reflectively. Mrs. Weedle, I mean, to enter a relationship at her age with so much money behind her, and without a prenup, she is in danger of being exploited, as you say. Mrs. Weedle used to be so prudent, one of the wisest, most astute women you could hope to meet. And then she does this. It's nonsensical, isn't it?
That's what love can do to you, Erin, dear, said her father, giving her an encouraging wink. I think for many people, signing a prenup agreement can appear offensive. It's rather like telling your partner, I don't trust you. I'm suspicious of your motives in marrying me, which doesn't bode for a good start. People can feel uncomfortable about prenups. Maybe Mrs. Weedle wants Reese to feel that she has full faith in their relationship and their love. But enough about Mrs. Weedle. How about you, Erin? Any handsome Englishmen eager to sweep you off your feet any time soon?
That ain't going to happen, Dad. And even if I did meet someone in England, which I highly doubt, I'd never leave America. This is my home. I love it here, and if I married an Englishman, I'd drag him over here kicking and screaming, and I mean that quite literally. I wouldn't settle anywhere else in the world. This is my home. Believe it or not, I'm incredibly patriotic.
Erin's father looked heartily relieved. Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that, Erin. I'd hate you to live in another country far away from us. That would be very disappointing. It's so good to have you back at home with us. Me and your mother have missed you, and Mr. Perkins has felt your absence greatly. You can see he's tickled pink to have you back home. The way I see it, London's gain has been North Carolina's loss. Your sisters and brothers will be coming up in a couple of days' time from New York and Boston to see you. Your mother's going to be laying out quite a spread. We're going to have a fabulous celebration. Lots of people have been invited. Everyone is looking forward to seeing you.
Sounds wonderful, said Erin, dunking a chocolate chip cookie into the warm milk and taking a bite. Oh, Mum, this is so scrumptious. I know I keep telling you that, but it is. No one makes chocolate chip cookies quite like you do.
Well, the credit goes to Martha Stewart and her fabulous recipe, said her mother. I've been using it for years, you know.
I hope you don't mind. I don't want to change the subject, said Erin obsequiously. I'm just so intrigued. I want to hear more about Mrs. Weedle and her love affair with this young Casanova. It's not every day I hear gossip like this. I never thought I'd ever say this, but I do miss small-town gossip. I really do, believe it or not.
I think that's a very good way to describe him, dear. That's what I believe he is. A Casanova, said Erin's mother thoughtfully, as she bit into one of her cookies, chewing it slowly. I'm sorry to say this, but I do not buy it for a moment that this young man, Reese, is in love with poor Mrs. Weedle. As you rightly pointed out, she's never had a boyfriend a day in her life until now. This Reese fellow looks like he could be on the cover of a magazine. So something's not right about this whole sordid business. Call me a cynic if you like, but I smell a rat, and the rat I'm smelling is seriously off. Pity we can't get Mr. Perkins here to sort him out. But some rats are far too big for Mr. Perkins to stomach, she teased. What do the townsfolk think about Mrs. Weedle's relationship with this young man, Reese? Asked Erin curiously. I'm quite sure Mrs. Weedle has stoked up the town's gossip to a frenzy and set the cat among the pigeons. Well, that is a very good way to put it, darling. They think that Reese is as slippery as butter. I was speaking to Mr. Paisley the other day. You know, the friendly butcher in town. He's still running his father's business, you know, down the high street. He always asks after you, by the way. Such a nice man he is. I told him you were flying in from London. He insisted on giving me 3 large lamb shranks free of charge to celebrate your homecoming. Isn't that really nice of him? He sent you lots and lots of love. We'll be eating them for dinner tonight. I've marinated them in red wine, rosemary and garlic. He remembers how partial you were to lamb. He's a sweetheart like that. You won't recognize him when you see him again. That man has lost over 100 pounds in weight. He's cut down on his high-protein diet and all that keto he'd been on for years. That simply wasn't working for him. He went to see a specialist, who told him that we've all got different body types, you see, and his body did not respond to an excess of protein. On his body, it just turned straight to fat. Ever since his change of diet, the weight has simply fallen off him. These days, he's practically living on vegetables and fish, which is rather funny since he's a butcher, isn't he? He looks $1 million these days, so much younger. Anyway, he was saying that anyone who meets Reese claims that the man never maintains eye contact with them, which I think proves he's up to no good. That's what your father means by shifty, I suspect. You know what, Mum, the one thing I'm learning about life is you have to let people make their own mistakes. My best friend Elspeth in Oxford started dating a real loser, and by real loser I mean real loser. He was the perennial cheat. Everyone knew about it, but Elspeth was blind to what he was really like. Although I suspect underneath the layers of her denial, she had a few wavering suspicions that he was a cheat. But she wanted to delude herself, as the truth was too inconvenient for her, I suspect. She had so many other men interested in her, really decent men, but she didn't give them a look in. I tried to warn her about this notorious shark, but would she listen? Not a chance. Instead, she got so defensive, and we nearly fell out because of the whole wretched business. So I decided from thenceforth to mind my own business and not to say a word. Sometimes you have to do that to keep the peace, don't you? What happened? Asked Erin's father.
Well, she ended up with a broken heart, didn't she? She's been on antidepressants ever since, put on about 70 pounds because she went ballistic on ice cream. Swears she's never going to trust another man ever again. I tried to tell her that most men are not like this fellow, but she ain't listening to a word I say. I guess you could say once bitten, twice shy. It's the same with both sexes, is it not? You get good and bad apples in the cart. But try to tell that to someone whose opinions are doggedly set in stone. It ain't any use, because they won't listen.
I think you're wise, Erin, not to get involved with all that, said her father. I mean, people end up hating you if you interfere in their lives, even though you mean well. The best thing is to be there for them when everything falls apart, to help them pick up the pieces. It's all you can do.
That's all well and good, said Erin's mother, but I think Mrs. Weedle is so smitten by what's-his-name.
Reese, said her husband. His name is Reese.
Oh, yes, Reese. Well, I think she's so bowled over by the man. I'm not sure if she'll cope if he pulls out the divorce card on her. And it's only a matter of time before that happens. I mean, she's in her mid-60s, is she not? I don't think she's going to take an end to that relationship terribly well. I worry it could potentially destroy her. I mean, he's her first boyfriend ever, and her husband, so it is a very big deal for her. You never know, Mum.
Maybe they're genuinely in love, said Erin reflectively. It's not impossible. There was a considerable age gap between Celine Dion and her husband, was there not? And by all accounts the couple were very much in love. This is very different, Erin, dear. Celine Dion and her husband were birds of a feather. They stick together, don't they? They had oodles and oodles in common, which rarely helps. I mean, they were both passionate about music. And I think her husband was her director at one point. That is such a promising start, is it not? We can only hope this is true love. But you know what Mrs. Wheedle's like. Despite her miraculous metamorphosis, I think underneath all the layers, she's quite a self-effacing, vulnerable woman. I worry about her getting badly hurt. She's another person who's lost a lot of weight, you know. She's taken up running. She and Loverboy regularly go running in your favourite old haunt. You mean the Woodgrove? Asked Erin, looking astounded. They're going into the Woodgrove? I can't believe it. Do you know Mrs. Wheedle used to lecture me about going to that place? She went on and on and on at me about the murder of the prostitute and how the killer was still at large and never been caught. Then she'd remind me of the stories of the haunted spectres that people claim to have seen there. Now she's running there daily. You've got to be kidding me. It's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black, is it not? So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. It's getting very exciting, warming up to something exceptional, and you're really going to enjoy it. So don't forget to tune in tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.